Okay, I think it's time to get started. So I'm going to share my screen and introduce myself. My name is Wendy Cho. I'm the Content and Outreach Senior Manager at Acterra, Action for a Healthy Planet. And today we are gathered to talk about the topic of food loss and waste and understand some of the challenges that we're facing and how we're going to approach solutions. And it is my great pleasure to be with you today to talk about this very important topic. So as we get started, I just wanted to introduce Acterra to everyone in case you're new to Acterra. We're an environmental nonprofit, and we've been serving the Bay Area since 1970. Our mission is bringing people together to create local solutions for a healthy planet. And we do this by encouraging individual behavior change and actions, and also by harnessing the power of policy advocacy to create broader change through legislation. You can find out more about our work at acterra.org. So how are we combating climate change at Acterra? We have four major pillars, the first of which is beneficial electrification of buildings and transportation. We also work on food. So we're focused on plant-based and plant-forward diets, and also reducing food waste, the topic of today's lecture. We also have a pillar devoted to education and youth empowerment, and we have a pillar devoted to advocacy. So a little bit more about our education pillar. So we have three aspects of this. We have the Youth Be the Change middle school curriculum, which is a curriculum about climate change, including both the impacts of it and also the solutions for it. And we work directly with teachers and help them promote these concepts about climate change in their classrooms and reach middle schoolers. We also have the public lecture series, which we're a part of today. And that is devoted to bringing together experts and different sector people to represent different sectors and talk about the issues that are most important to climate action today. We also have Acterra's Student Ambassadors Program, which is a high school program and also community college students, where they can get more involved in things like public commenting at city council meetings and other gatherings. This lecture series, Cultivating Solutions, continues in November. So please join us for The Smell of Money. It's a film screening on November 12th. The doors will open at 2:30 p.m. and this is an in-person event at the Palo Alto Art Center on Newell Road. This is a movie that is currently not playing in any Bay Area theaters. It is being screened in LA currently. So we're really excited to bring you this exclusive presentation. We'll also have the writer, Jamie Berger. She's a co-producer on The Smell of Money. She'll be answering our questions via Zoom. So please join us for this really exciting event on November 12th. And thank you to SoulPods, 350 Silicon Valley, and Menlo Spark for co-presenting this event. And here's a few other events that Acterra is promoting for this current time period. We have the Plentiful Fall Dietary Challenge, which is to encourage people to eat lower on the food chain and eat more sustainably during this 4-week period of October 23rd to November 20th. So please sign up for that. We also have a heat pump water heater workshop, part of our Green at Home workshop series, on November 1st from 6 to 7 p.m. That'll be on Zoom. And you can find all of these events at acterra.org/events. And we also have a financial incentives clinic and EV Expo on November 11th, Saturday. This is going to be in person at Palo Alto. So another exciting thing to put on your calendars. And then we have a partner event that we wanted to feature as well. The Humane Planet Speaker Series invites you to Justice for Animals, Our Collective Responsibility. We'll be hearing from Martha Nussbaum, who is a very noted academic. And so this should be a really interesting discussion as well, October 25th. And a quick thank you to the people who made this event possible, our series underwriters, Mary and Clinton Gilliland, and Armand and Eliane Nukermans. Thank you so much. We also want to thank our series sponsors, LinkedIn and The Foster. And finally, we do appreciate your community support to help keep our events free. So if you're able to do so, we encourage you to visit acterra.org/donate now. So let's move on to what we're going to be discussing today. We have a question and answer period, which we're hoping will be really interesting and take us on many paths through the topic of food loss and waste. So please use the Q&A feature, not the chat, in Zoom at the bottom of your screen to ask your question, or you can also upvote another question that has already been asked by using the little thumbs up icon. And don't forget that before you go, we have a survey for you to fill out so that we can continue to improve our programming in the lecture series. So thank you so much. So today, it's my great pleasure to welcome three amazing leaders in the food loss and waste space. They are Yuka Nagashima from Food Shift. She's the executive director. We have Selena Mao from ReFed. She's an impact analyst. And we have Dr. Lisa K. Johnson, who is an independent consultant and expert on farm loss. And you can find their full bios on acterra.org/lectures. So right now, I'd love to welcome Yuka to start sharing her screen, and we'll find out more about the exciting work that Food Shift is doing. Take it away, Yuka.
Hi, greetings, everyone. I'm sorry I can't see all of your faces. Hope you can get loud in chat to say hello and share your tips for how to prevent or how to maximize food use and prevent wasted food. So today you didn't come to hear me. I'm going to be moderating. So just a brief overview of Food Shift. I have a video. We are a food recovery organization. That means we recover food that would otherwise go to waste, mainly from food producers. So they could be farmers, but mostly whole produce, whole markets. So wholesale markets that are producing or providing produce. So here is what we do. It's called Operation Together.
Operation Together is Food Shift's food recovery and redistribution program. While we had a food recovery program prior to 2020, we amped up our program in response to COVID, providing excess food from wholesalers and other grocers to our neighbors in need through our partnering organizations. 3 times per week, our senior food recovery specialist, Robert, goes to produce markets and picks up excess food that vendors are unable to sell because of surplus, mislabeling, peak ripeness, or slight imperfections. It's often hard to tell why the food is coming through our doors, and hard to imagine that if we had not gone to pick it up, it would have gone to landfill. The food gets brought back to our headquarters in Alameda, and Food Shift staff, culinary on-the-job trainees, and volunteers weigh and sort the produce. The recovered food is carefully curated to reflect the physical and cultural needs of each partner. Some partners prefer bulk fruits and vegetables, while others need produce bags packed. Each step in the process is done with safety, care, and dignity in mind. These organizations specialize in serving people that have been marginalized by our society, ranging from houseless folks, domestic violence survivors, recent immigrants, people who identify as Black and mixed race, veterans, and people with disabilities, all populations that are often overlooked. Since April 2020, 291 tons of food has been redistributed. Operation Together nourishes 13,000 plus neighbors weekly. Through our food waste reduction, education, and advocacy efforts, we want to see less of this and more of this. We are bringing to light that there is value in each person and the power to nourish in every fruit and vegetable.
Thank you. So that's Food Shift, and I am joined today with our 2 esteemed panelists. And so I wanted to, rather than go through their esteemed profiles, which you can read in the Acterra website, I wanted to get more personal and maybe have their connections to wasted food. And so I'm going to go to Selena first, and maybe you can talk about the lens that you're bringing to this work.
Definitely. I also very much appreciate the paradigm shift here of sort of getting personal. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Selena. I'm a research analyst at ReFed, and we're a national nonprofit dedicated to sort of highlighting the extent of the problem, but also highlighting the available suite of solutions that we have at our disposal across the value chain. I'd say my involvement in this realm, I think, started off quite personally. My mom was an immigrant to the US, and when she was growing up, she lived through the Great Chinese Famine. And so I think from a very early age, perhaps because of the trauma that she experienced, I sort of knew from a very young age that, like, wasting even one grain of rice was like kind of a morally bad thing. And of course, there's a lot of shame tied up in that. But I think, I very much sort of grew up with that sort of value. And I think when I got to grad school, I was like, wait a minute, I can actually study this and study the impacts of wasted food on our environment, on our economies. And so now I get the really fun job of sort of talking to various solution providers in the space and getting to hear and quantify the extent of the impacts that they're bringing to waste reduction.
I appreciate Selena's story. Similarly, in Japanese culture, we talk about mottainai, which is sort of like the shame associated with wasteful actions. So.
Yes, definitely. I am very, very familiar with mottainai. It's a great philosophy. So I guess this is a good point as any to sort of start off by talking about what we are here to learn about. And that is the inconceivable problem that we have here in the US, which is that a staggering 38% of all food produced for human consumption goes unsold or uneaten. And so if we translate this into behavior, essentially, if you walk into a grocery store, buy 5 bags of groceries, you walk out, and before you get to your car, you throw away 2 bags in the garbage. And of course, that sounds ridiculous. Like, none of us would do that. But that's exactly what we're doing throughout the global supply chain. And of course, at the same time, we have 1 in 10 Americans experiencing food insecurity. And that number, of course, has gotten worse with COVID and with inflation and rising food prices. So there's clearly this inefficiency in our supply chain. And I think that, to me, is at least the paradox that we kind of need to really reconcile. And of course, the consequences of all this wasted food are profound. According to the EPA, food waste makes up the single largest volume of materials sent to landfills in the US, where it rots and emits methane. And recent figures suggest that wasted food was responsible for at least 4% of all US GHG emissions, which is roughly equivalent to fueling 55 million gas-powered cars, or roughly 20% of all cars that are currently on the road. Globally, this translates to, there's a typo there, I'm sorry, 8 to 10% of GHGs, which is at least double that of emissions from aviation. In fact, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, if food waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter in the world, which is really kind of a staggering number to think about. And when we waste food, it's not just the broccoli or the pasta that we're throwing away, it's all of the energy, water, labor, resources that went into producing, processing, transporting, and preparing that food. And so this chart shows that food sort of accumulates emissions as it moves along the value chain. So when we waste food, all the emissions incurred in getting food to your plate is essentially for nothing. And so, as I pointed out before, as food waste decomposes in landfills or gets burned by incinerators, it generates methane, which is a significantly higher and more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. But there is hope, and I don't want to end on doom and gloom note. Addressing food waste reduces emissions in 3 ways. Recent studies indicate that diverting food waste completely from landfill can reduce methane generated by roughly 33%. at the sort of household level, by consuming what we buy, we are honoring the upstream emissions from production, transport, all the way to preparation. And I think here it's also definitely worth mentioning the implications for land use. The land that is used to grow uneaten food in the US accounts for 16% of agricultural land, which is roughly the size of New York and California combined. And so reducing food waste maximizes land use by ensuring that the land dedicated to growing the food that we eat is utilized efficiently. And of course, less waste means optimized use of resources and space, hopefully putting a halt to unnecessary expansion of agricultural land. And I think oftentimes, tackling climate change feels like this huge, intractable problem, but there are some sort of practical steps we can all take as consumers to alleviate food waste impact on the environment. And I won't go through all of these, but I will say that first, start by planning ahead and buying in smaller quantities, especially when it comes to perishable items. I think sticking to a shopping list can go a long way in reducing unnecessary waste. There are so many inventive ways as well to make use of leftovers and inedible parts. I think I saw somewhere in the chat that someone was featured on a TV show about sort of utilizing the whole vegetable. I also like to follow a rule called FIFO, so first in, first out. So the food that goes into the fridge gets consumed first. And of course, there's so many fun ways that you can utilize your beet greens and your broccoli stems. And I think the third that I will end on here, and it's probably the most important, is understanding that date labels typically refer to quality and not safety. And so right now there's like there's a whole sort of slew of different date labels that are driving confusion at the consumer level. And so knowing how to decipher the meaning behind these labels can avoid unnecessary throwing out of food. And then beyond just our homes, I think advocating for policies and supporting policies like SB 1383 that targets food waste on a larger scale is, of course, really important. And here, I think, as always, collective advocacy can really bring about some meaningful change. So thank you, everyone, for listening in. And I hand it back to you, Yuka.
Thank you, Selena. So we're gonna hear more from Selena, and we're just gonna have a casual conversation amongst us. And so before we do that, we want to hear from Lisa. If you could share your before we share your screen, I wanted to ask you sort of what is the lens you are bringing to the wasted food and food loss community, and what's your take on it, and how did you get connected?
Thanks, Yuka. This is such a great question, and nobody ever really asks, why do we do what we do? So I'm excited to be able to share. Thrilled to see that almost all of y'all's pictures were fruit and vegetables. I'm a horticulturist, so that's what's most important to me day in and day out is fruit and vegetables, and I am just blown away by how they are produced and how they get to us. The more personal lens that I bring to this work is that I'm a parent of two beautiful, amazing children. And once I had my first, the work that I was doing took on a lot more weight. I really believe in the endless potential of human beings and certainly of children. And the children that aren't as secure in their nutrition might not be able to reach that potential. So knowing what I know about our food system, I want to make sure that everything that we produce reaches someone that can eat it. So the food is maximized for human consumption. I have a particular heart for little kids, mostly mine, admittedly. But as a mama bear, so to speak, I would do whatever it takes to make sure they have everything they need. And we shouldn't have to struggle so hard to get what it is that they need. So knowing that there's almost an endless supply of fruit and vegetables, I want to make sure that gets to people. Let me share my screen and I'll tell you a little bit about why I'm here. I'm an independent consultant and researcher and have worked for a long time on food loss rather than food waste. Let me just share my screen and give you a little insight on the difference. First of all, there's no agreed upon definition that separates food loss from food waste, and different organizations have different definitions that they use. The one that makes the most sense to me, and it might be different for you, is that the supply chain itself is kind of separated, and that food loss happens early on in the supply chain, typically on farms, in storage, and in distribution, and is the result of technical limitations or constraints that may happen along the way. Whereas food waste happens later on in the supply chain and is more often the result of a decision or a behavior in some way. And so, being that I work on one area and not the whole supply chain, it makes sense for me to kind of lean on this definition. I work specifically on food loss in agricultural production. So here's a picture of a cabbage field. I have cabbage behind me. What very often happens toward the end of a season for a certain field is that a lot of food is left behind in the field. It remains in the field unharvested, never reaching our supply chain at all. So this issue is sort of hidden unless you live on or near a farming community. This is not something that people see or talk about very often. But if you take a look at this field, a 10-acre field, which is relatively small in vegetable production, still contained over a truckload of cabbage when it was disked in, which is the ultimate destination for this particular cabbage. 84% of it was perfectly fresh, healthy, safe, and edible for humans. So this happens in every crop around the country every single day. Crops are tilled in rather than finding a human being to nourish, right? So the reason that I have these types of numbers is because my work has mostly involved measurement and estimation of these losses in these fields. And in working with ReFed over the years, they have leaned on some of the data that I've provided to create estimates for their insights engine. But if you live in California, you live in New York, Michigan, Florida, wherever you are, this is happening. Maybe you've driven by a field of watermelon that looks like it's still full, but it's just about to be disked in. These things happen because of constraints in our marketplace and sort of a mismatch between the supply we have and the demand that we're able to serve. If you think about, we have an unlimited amount of food in the field. We basically have an unlimited unmet demand in those of us who are food insecure. So our supply chain is not working correctly to serve everyone. That's why this happens. The types of quality that you see in the field is really variable at the end of the season. There's still a lot of food left in fields that's perfectly marketable. So it looks exactly like what you would find in a grocery store. It's got the right size, the right shape, the right color to move on down the supply chain. But it's sort of coexisting in the field with another amount that is just edible. You might consider it imperfect. So it's not quite the right shape or size, and it might have a small blemish. It might be a little miscolored, but it's still perfectly fresh and safe and healthy to eat. Then there's another portion of the field that's unfit for human consumption by American cultural standards, which are quite strict. We don't just cut that part out anymore as a society. So if something is damaged or decayed, it's considered unfit. So all of these different qualities exist in the field at the same time, and it becomes inefficient for crews who are harvesting by hand to look or search past these two categories just to find the marketable quality. So it becomes slower to harvest. It costs more money, therefore, and growers have to shift their labor to other fields to be sure they're being efficient. I've asked growers what they see as the solution to having to leave crops in the field, and overwhelmingly, they've all fallen into these categories. Growers really want to see buyers that continue buying from them consistently and prices that cover their costs to harvest, which they don't always see. Farming has a very slim margin for profit, if you didn't know. They also want more options available to have their crop processed and value added into something else. Most growers don't have these options where they are. It's sort of because of the consolidation of the food processing industry. We lack a lot of medium scale processors. Growers would, of course, like to see an increase in produce demand. This would be from people who are not currently receiving fresh produce, or those of us who do have regular access to food really need to be eating more. As Americans, we don't fulfill our dietary needs. They would like to donate more, but are not incentivized to do so. Often it's harder to donate produce than it is to sell it. To make sure someone's coming to pick it up, that it's cared for properly and all. That growers are interested in alternative marketing schemes like ugly produce programs, and they will try these programs until it doesn't work for them. And they're also interested in us as consumers, remembering that fresh produce is a natural product and is not always uniform. And growers do often feed animals and apply these crops to their land, as we know, with a tiller or a disc. But there are some actions that you can take as consumers. One is to realize, again, that food is grown mostly outdoors and is not grown in perfect conditions and therefore might not be perfect. If you see an odd shape, it might be due to insufficient pollination because of wet conditions during bloom time, not, because of something that the farmer did or didn't do. Understand that the costs of producing fruit and vegetables are massive, and it's very important for growers to get that back to be economically sustainable, which is one of the 3 pillars of sustainability, and thereby staying in business. And once again, avoiding blaming farmers for losses. So when you see pictures of losses and they appear to be on a farm, remember that the loss occurred at that part of the supply chain, but may not have been driven by a decision at that part of the supply chain. Many of the solutions that growers have offered are outside of what they can manage or control. So they were really relying on consumers, buyers, retailers, and policy to get them out of this problem. I'll stop there and we can continue on with the discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa. So maybe one of the things that people have not confusion, but maybe ambiguity around is that, when farmers leave some stuff not harvested, some people say like, hey, but wouldn't that just go back to the, as compost, like nourish the land? So like, what's the loss? So maybe if Lisa and Selena could talk about the concept of highest and best use with the diagram that you had also, Lisa.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly. Yuka, that's exactly what I was going to say. It does return some nutrients to the land, although I haven't seen a lot of studies on that. The growers that we have in the US who provide food through our wholesale marketplace channels are extremely sophisticated. They're testing their soil for nutrients so they can have custom fertility blends created for them. You know, they choose cultivars based on marketability. They often have really sensitive and sophisticated irrigation systems and very strict pest and disease management programs. So they're doing everything they can to produce. When that crop is returned back to the land, it's doubtless returning some nutrients, and it's sort of, in a way, composted in place, if you can imagine. However, that does end up creating some methane in the process, and it's not a typical compost ratio that might lead to an ideal blend, but there are likely some benefits to returning the crop to the soil. Again, it's just not the highest and best use. Selena, you had something to add.
Yeah, definitely a little bit more zoomed out, but I would say that, like, you know, that sort of food recovery hierarchy that Lisa showed a very, very detailed version of is obviously very like human centric. And so starting out with the first, when we talk about you know, like what is the best use? Well, it's the food, like according to that hierarchy, you know, preventing surplus from happening in the first place and reducing it at the source is number one. Number two is like sort of making sure that whatever does result in surplus gets routed to feeding those who are experiencing food insecurity, redistributing wholesome food. Of course, you know, donating food and ensuring that perishable food is routed in the most efficient way, sometimes to people who in communities who need them. The third tier is sort of like feeding animals. So, you know, constituting food scraps in a way that can be economical for farms and companies to feed their animals and livestock, as opposed to hauling them to landfill, which accrues, you know, transportation and waste, landfill tipping costs. And then I think as you get towards the tip of that triangle, you go further and further down in terms of sort of least preferred destinations. So I think after animal feed, you have industrial uses, so converting wasted food to biofuels, and et cetera, and then composting, which is sort of what Lisa was alluding to, sort of disking food into the ground as a sort of form of soil amendment, or as a way of nourishing the soil. And then, of course, the last and least preferable is, you know, committing or hauling that food away to landfill. So it's a helpful, I think, framework to think about in the food waste space. So that was a long-winded explanation.
Well, it's all complex, you know,
Yeah.
lots of market forces, logistics, you know, farmers gotta eat. And let's also acknowledge that the laborers for farming are probably the most marginalized of our people. And ironic that folks who are providing are you know, working so hard to provide the rest of us with food are themselves food insecure. So maybe we can talk about, I think many of us today gathered for this session are aware of, you know, how food is maybe not used to its maximum capacity, and that's why they're coming to this session. So maybe we can talk about some of the myths or things that maybe are commonly mistaken or misunderstood about food loss or wasted food.
I'm happy to start off here. I think I mentioned it earlier, but I think one myth that sort of cuts across sectors is that, you know, the expiration date on the food, you know, packaging is an absolute indicator of its safety. I think I alluded to the fact that currently we haven't quite aligned on sort of like a dual system of indicating those two parameters, but sell by, use by, best before are often manufacturer suggestions for peak quality and not strict deadlines for safety. I think, as many of you will know, many foods that we come across that are past their sell-by date are still really perfectly edible and safe to consume after these dates. I like to use just a simple sniff test. And I think this misunderstanding oftentimes contributes to a lot of unnecessary food waste. So I think trusting your senses and using kind of common sense can go a long way in reducing food waste. Also, eggs float when they're bad. So if you ever were curious on whether or not the carton of eggs sitting in your fridge is bad, just try the float test too.
Also, yeah, eggs stink when they're bad. So that's easy. Yeah, that's true. I think a lot of us now think of it as safety, like, oh, I can't provide this for my family because the can says 2020, October 2023, like, oh, it's now October, like, is that safe? I mean, it doesn't automatically become unsafe November 1st, so yeah, so it's important to remind ourselves of that. Lisa, do you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, thinking about farm production, there is one misconception that I hear a lot, and it gets repeated quite a bit. So that's hard to hear. But one of the things that people tell me very often is that farms overproduce, in particular, the food that we need to sustain life. I would argue that we have an inequitable distribution system, and we have a population that underconsumes fresh produce. If we were all eating what we needed to be eating every day, we would need to double our production. However, all of those things just take into account that quality which is marketable and that is harvested and comes off the farm. So, we wouldn't, even if we all went to the store today to pick up our FDA recommended number of fruit and vegetables, we still wouldn't need to double production because we have 20 to 40% more that's healthy and edible sitting in the field right now. So it can look like farms are overproducing, but what's happening is our system isn't serving everyone, and those that it's serving aren't eating enough fruit and vegetables. So I really feel like we need to consider our farmers as partners in our public health and support them in more ways than we do. I think another big misconception about farming in general is that it's just all handled by machine. So many people that I talk to don't understand that the essential foods that we need to stay healthy are harvested by hand, not by machine. But we have kind of an idyllic, romanticized view of a very far off farm with a tractor crawling along harvesting a grain product, and the foods that we need to eat more of aren't harvested that way at all. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to go over to some questions that are coming in the Q&A. So I encourage all the folks joined today to write in your questions in the Q&A tab there. The first question is from Alex. Isn't it a market failure for farmers to grow edible food that isn't accepted? Wouldn't that reduce the value of what they're selling when they have higher supply that isn't actually being sold?
That's a great question. Is it a market failure when they have a crop that doesn't sell? I think I'm getting that. And And does an increase in supply affect the price? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. All of these things do happen. What we have in the US is a serious imbalance of power between buyers and farmers. Farmers don't get to set their own prices on fresh produce. The buyers who can drop them as suppliers at will set the prices. So farmers have to take that price, whatever it is. If they want to negotiate, they're really just driving the price down further for either their neighbor or their competitor. So it's a really difficult challenge. About half of our food, our fruit and vegetables, are not grown on contract. So, you know, if you have a massive farm that's 10,000 acres and you have a lot of overhead, you absolutely have contracts with retailers to purchase your product. But if you have 500 acres or 1,000 acres, you may not have any contracts at all. Most of the fresh produce buying and selling takes place on the basis of a handshake agreement. These things can go south really quickly. And if a transaction didn't happen for whatever reason, the grower, you know, has that crop left at their farm or in the field or on a truck somewhere, and they have to pay to have that returned. So yes, it's a market failure. The market is failing our growers and our consumers. And yes, if there's too much available, the price goes down. But if you think about it, there's never too much available.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add there, Selena?
I think Lisa nailed it.
Let me move on to the question about communities that have food scraps recycling. Is methane production from discarded food still a concern?
Yeah, I'm happy to try and tackle that one. So when food scraps are, the difference is the difference is when you're composting food, the food scraps that are being composted is in a controlled environment, means that the decomposition process is aerobic, which means that there's the presence of oxygen. And in this kind of condition, microorganisms break down the organic matter into compost through a series of biological processes that I won't get into. But this is in contrast to an anaerobic decomposition, which occurs in the absence of oxygen and produces methane. And so when food waste ends up in landfills without proper aeration, it undergoes an anaerobic decomposition. And so in this sort of oxygen deprived environment, methane is reduced as a byproduct. And so as long the sort of like composting is different from landfill to that extent, and allows these microorganisms to efficiently break down without producing significant amounts of methane.
Thanks. I hope that answered the question for you, Jen. And then maybe a different type of food loss. Of course, businesses try to minimize food loss because that's part of their inventory and their cost. But restaurants, there are food loss associated with restaurant work. And so maybe we can talk about different types of food loss categories in restaurants.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in restaurants, loss can, might occur if like perishable ingredients aren't stored properly. If your parsley and your dill aren't, wrapped up in paper towels. And I'm just drawing from, I previously worked at a restaurant. But, it could also happen like in sort of ways that are kind of go beyond our control. It could happen during the transport of ingredients from your suppliers to the restaurant. Waste, might happen when prepared dishes aren't like fully consumed by customers and are thrown away. It could also be attributed to sort of excess of food that's prepared that doesn't get sold before its expiration date. And so I think just to sort of sum up, food loss is really more associated with like inefficiencies and losses perhaps earlier in the supply chain, often before the food reaches the food service establishment. And then on the other hand, food waste tends to occur within the food service establishment itself, and is more about the disposal of food that was at one point suitable for consumption. I say that with kind of a big caveat. I'm currently helping to advise on a project with the Menus of Change Research Consortium, and they are trying to quantify the impact of repurposing prepared food and ingredients back into meals for students. And so to that end, there are still, I think, viable ways to reuse and reconstitute food waste in a way that is, of course, culturally accepted. But happy to share the outcomes of that research with you all once it becomes available.
Yeah, there are lots of restaurants, doing their best to minimize food loss by, because when you have little stars made out of carrots, what's the rest of the carrot doing, or cute little things to put in your cocktails, where's the rest of that fruit going? And so there are restaurants who are now making these little fruit slices as dried fruit so that they last longer for decorations for cocktails. And of course, if they're cutting specific vegetables in specific shapes for very high-end cuisine, that the rest of it could go to broth or in soups or stews or pureed. So there's trim waste, like obviously things that you can't eat, like stems of or eggplant or too tough a part that you can't eat. But there's also serving sizes where American portions are notorious for being big, and most of us do leave some food on the plate. And so I see restaurants offering multiple sizes. And so that's another way. Are there other ways that restaurants are or other folks are innovating the solutions?
I don't work in restaurants, but I know a couple organizations that work to help restaurants measure the food waste that's happening there. For example, Lean Path and Winnow are two that come to mind. They both use imaging and AI to track the food waste that happens in kitchens in an effort to link that to restaurant economics and environmental impact so that the culture of reducing waste spreads among staff and that the whole staff sort of starts to understand the impacts of that scrap. And so I love the work that they're doing. I see you nodding. Selena's more familiar with these organizations than I am. So
no, but you covered it. There's a lot of I think more towards the technical side of solutions, a lot of players in the food service industry that are, employing AI, like Lisa mentioned, sensing of all different kinds to sort of help hone in on different hotspots throughout a food service operation. I know that there's also, I'm thinking about a specific company that works with sort of helping bakeries and cafes find a sort of second I don't want to say second life, but like a product for baked goods that
Upcycling.
well, there's upcycling. I was thinking of like markdown alert applications, and so applications that sort of tie directly into a restaurant or food services sort
Too
of like
good to go.
yes, exactly, that help different sort of establishments find and sell sort of unsold products to secondary markets.
Yeah, I think that's true for farming as well. There are companies like Full Harvest that's trying to identify second markets for quote unquote imperfect. I mean, also I think we should challenge when we say things like perfect produce, because usually perfect produce, like for whom? Perfect produce for a grocery store is usually not perfect for us to eat, that they're not ripe enough. Right? So yeah, so let's revisit how and while we're on the nomenclature, I think we can shift our mind a little bit better if we start talking about wasted food rather than food waste.
Yes.
Because it started off as food. We wasted it. Yes. So the noun is food, not waste. It didn't start off as waste. So just that shift hopefully could get us to embrace more that we have an active part in maximizing food use. I'm also seeing a lot of chat activity to embrace the wisdom of our not just our panelists, but our participants today, our session listeners. So yes, please keep sharing your ideas. I know there are questions that we asked that you already have answers to, so please do share them. We have just about 5 minutes to go, so maybe one final question, which might be a policy level question. How can we incentivize more local food supply chains to reduce food loss that often occurs due to infrastructure and logistics of moving and transporting food from field to fork?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that, very often we have opportunities for each sort of segment of our supply chain. Maybe restaurants are incentivized, or grocery stores are incentivized, or farms are incentivized in one way or another. But the way food moves around is critically important. And so what would be helpful is more funding for infrastructure at the middle of the supply chain, which is what these things are sometimes called, the messy middle. When you're transporting food, in particular fresh produce, which is my go-to, each particular crop has its own handling requirements. And so when those are not met, if it's temperature or packaging or commingling with other fruit and vegetables, there can be loss or damage, making that food no longer suitable for sale. And so, oftentimes these are because of mistakes that are made here and there with temperature abuse, or maybe a forklift has rammed into, a stack of boxes. But some of these things are avoidable in that we need the proper infrastructure to handle them. So we've had a couple of years ago, there was a shortage of truck drivers. And believe it or not, things like that really affect our food distribution systems. So, what can end up happening is temperature logs are not maintained, produce gets too hot or cold, and ends up where its destination unusable. So it gets rejected. The farm has to take responsibility for that, and it's kind of starts a cascade of events that will lead to that food ending up in the landfill. So I think that, we could better support our messy middle with more funding, but that might be a policy issue. It might be a grant issue. I'm not sure. Good question.
Do you have any to add, Selena?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, I think it's to sort of add on to what Lisa was saying, I do think it's probably a mix of policy and like local procurement policies. Implementing policies that encourage, large government institutions, for example, and businesses to prioritize purchasing from local and regional suppliers, as well as, a mix of sort of like grant funding. Something that comes to mind is the Center for Good Food Purchasing standard, which came out of the LA region. And essentially what it is like a pretty groundbreaking framework that aims to promote a more equitable, sustainable, and local food system by providing like a set of criteria and guidelines for major institutions like schools, hospitals, and government agencies to make responsible and ethical food purchasing decisions that center around like supporting the local food economy. And so essentially like institutions that adopt the standard commit to evaluating their food purchasing practices based on a set of 5 criteria that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But what this allows for is to sort of work towards a more sustainable, locally based food system, obviously with many impacts on the local economies, but also the environment as well. And I think it's a really powerful tool to drive positive change in an increasingly consolidated food industry.
I think food area is extremely interesting because we think of so many environmental issues as being too big for any one of us to tackle. And we think of like policy as being something, but I think this is one of those areas where actually we all have a part in it, whether we change our diet or the way we use our freezer. We can be using our freezer more often. So maybe to conclude, if you could give one tip each for what we can be doing in our own homes to be climate activists.
Selena, can you give 2 if it's in the home?
Let me just go back to my slides. I think one, like Yuka, you already mentioned this, like lean on your freezer. The freezer is your friend at practically anything, like rice, from takeout to avocados can be frozen. So it just lean on that heavily. And I think, properly storing foods depending on the food type. There's a lot of good resources out there that, can show you the way of like preserving your cilantro for, an X number of days, and how to properly preserve whole fruits. So definitely lean on those resources, because we live in an age of information, and it's there's a lot out there. That was a very broad answer.
So I hope everybody can like put in the chat before you log out to say what you're committed to doing to maximize food use and reduce food loss.
And while you're doing that, I wanted to just give a round of applause to our speakers and our wonderful moderator for sharing their insights today. Thank you so much. I personally learned a ton about the entire long chain, and I love that we focused the attention at the end on what we can personally do in our own lives. So thank you all so much for coming. And yes, please drop your actions in the chat and keep this issue front and center when you're at the next shopping run. Thank you all so much. And we'll send out the recording when it's available. Thank you and goodbye.